Okay, great. I think just before we kick off, I'm going to ask everybody to just a quick introduction, just to let us know who we are interviewing today. So please, maybe if you can start, Pat, that will be great.
Yeah, it's my pleasure, Andel. Thank you so much for having us on your podcast today. My name is Pat Lipovski. I'm the founder and CEO of the Envision Group, and the Envision Group is we're really a group of former executives and consultants that have bonded together for the benefit of organizations around the world on different topics. But myself, I live in Calgary, Alberta, Canada, and literally don't spend a lot of time under normal circumstances at home, but have been traveling around the world for the last 23 years, doing leadership support, strategy consulting, and now a little bit of financial private equity work with Bob Peterson, and you'll find out more from him in just a moment. So thanks for having me on the call. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Great. Bob, over to you.
Yeah, as Pat said, Bob Peterson, I'm a senior partner in the Envision Group. I've been in the energy industry about 40 years. Did my first career with Mobil, ExxonMobil, and then Schlumberger, and then went off into the management consulting world. And as Pat said, about 3 years ago, I joined a private equity firm in Houston as well. So I'm working with both Fieldstone Partners and with the Envision Group on strategy, funding strategy, and strategy execution. And as we'll discuss, increasingly, we're getting involved in strategy and funding projects that are entwined with ESG.
Great, thank you. Dr. Hugh, you can give us a quick intro on yourself as well, please.
Yes, not a problem. Good morning, everyone. My name is Hugh Dunleavey. I've primarily worked in the airline industry for about 40 years. First got to know Pat when I brought him in to work with me at one of the airlines in Calgary, and then later brought him in to work with me with the team in Malaysia, where I was Chief Commercial Officer at Malaysia Airlines. And I've been working with Pat for the past 3 or so years, working on strategy, people development, leadership skills, etc., and basically applying all the knowledge I learned in working in the airline business in different countries, different continents, and applying it so that we can be of assistance to companies. So that's what I've been doing, and I'll hand it back to you now.
Awesome, thank you. So any one of you can take this next question. Just give us a bit of an overview of who exactly is Envision.
Well, I'll start that off, Bob, and then I'll hand it to you and Hugh. It's so the Envision Group, again, as I mentioned, we're a group of former executives, accomplished executives and consultants that we spend time doing 3 primary items. We do strategy work with different companies, and not just strategy at the high end. We've got a bit of a uniqueness to us in that we do strategy alignment, and we do a bottom-up engagement of strategy to really lift organizations in all the best ways. With that requires some sense of strategy, leadership support for strategy. So we've done leadership training, leadership coaching, executive training, but it all lends to to the whole side of ensuring that companies are heading in the right direction and people are engaged and following along with what's needed most. So the Envision team is, of course, we've been working in multiple industries. We've specialized both in the energy industry, airline industry. We also do work, of course, a considerable amount of work in healthcare and technology. And with that, Bob, we'll hand it over to you to cover off some of the other items.
Yeah, I would add, Pat, that we're not a huge organization. At the core of us, maybe 20 very experienced senior executives across energy, across healthcare, and across aviation. And what we're finding, as I mentioned earlier, the Envision Group is now partnering with Fieldstone, where Fieldstone provides financing and financing strategy. And as Pat likes to say, the Envision Group provides through leadership training, coaching, accountability, performance measurement, the insurance policy that the money delivers to the stakeholders. And as I've been working with energy firms, more and more the consideration of ESG comes up. In particular, as you probably have noted, Andel, there are literally several trillions of dollars now in various big private equity funds who are all saying we require you, Mr. or Ms. potential client, to have a well-articulated ESG strategy in execution. And if you don't have that, well, worst case, we're going to charge you more for capital, or excuse me, best case, and worst case, we're not going to do business with you. So it's becoming real.
Dr. Hugh, do you have anything to add on to that?
No, I except to just re-emphasize what Bob said. We believe regulations will become increasingly more strict as we move forward. And as I lead the airline or the aviation practice, we're seeing more and more countries starting to apply increased regulation and oversight. And particularly for an industry where you are emitting significant amounts of greenhouse gases, it's increasingly important for us to be on top of this issue and work with our aviation partners to see what mechanisms we can use to help have an ESG strategy in place, and then work with them to say, well, now how do we execute that strategy? And I think that's been a key role for us at Envision.
Great. Apologies, yes?
Yeah, sorry, one thing to add, if that's all right. I apologize for jumping in. It's interesting because our whole pursuit in both strategy consulting and the work Bob is doing, of course, on the financing side and the capital sourcing side, we have also merged as one last item. And Bob, I know you'll smile when I say this, but we merged in a number some time ago into the carbon credit part of the industry as well, because you look at ESG, companies are moving to become carbon neutral. And we had been giving some counsel advice and a little bit of consulting to different organizations in the field of carbon credits. And Bob, if you want to expand on that.
Yeah, it's especially in industries that are asset heavy and consume a lot of energy. And it's virtually impossible for these, I'd say, asset-heavy industries to, on their own, through various technology and efficiency improvements, get to zero carbon. So my clients, in particular, energy clients, who may have a fairly significant budget to move towards zero carbon, carbon credits are always part of that strategy, just because you can't get on your own to zero. And as Pat said, we have a client partner who has a large stake on some original growth rainforests, and we're working with them to broker and include those carbon credits in the companies we work with as part of our strategy.
Oh, that makes a lot of sense. And I think you guys have partially answered this question already, but why did your firm specifically decide to specialize in ESG training and consulting?
I'll start that one off and I'll hand it over to Hugh, especially on the airline side. But, it's interesting because, again, consulting with organizations for so many years, sustainability and safety, the capital E of ESG has been a huge item of focus both in the airline and the energy industry. We landed on ESG not as a matter of desire most recently. This has been something we've been focusing on for years. And of course, it's now evolved into the three letters of ESG, but it's of course called sustainability prior to that. Hugh, anything to add to that from the airline perspective and aviation perspective?
Yeah, no, a couple of points really. In the aviation space, of course, we are concerned about greenhouse gas emissions. And we also recognize that for the customers of airlines, as an example, they're also equally concerned about what we're doing to the environment. And so with our engagements with various airlines, we have observed an increasing focus on them to make sure that they did achieve a carbon neutral status within a certain time frame. Not an easy challenge. They also recognize that when you start emitting gases at 35 to 40,000 feet, it has a much more deleterious effect on the environment. So airlines, we recognized, were certainly moving towards achieving some degree of offset for the carbon they're emitting as a natural consequence of their business. And they're integrating that into their overall business strategy. And any organization that is a significant generator of greenhouse gases and does not have a robust ESG strategy in place we'll run into serious problems, as Bob has identified earlier. So from an Envision point of view, engaging with companies early on, making sure the strategy is aligned with where their investment strategies are going. It's pointless buying old aircraft as an example with, let's say, inefficient engines, as opposed to investing up front on more efficient engines, reducing their greenhouse gases from one approach, and then looking for ways to offset that to try and get to that much lower carbon footprint in their industry. So overall, it's a combination of not only the regulatory effects, but it's also conscious actions by airlines recognizing that they have a responsibility to reduce their carbon footprint, and then working with them to make sure every organization, every department in that organization is aligned and they understand why we're going down this path and how important it is to the sustainability of that organization.
Great.
So with that, I'll hand it back to you.
Thanks. And before we dive into the details, what does Envision's ESG training offer and do for participants at a high level?
Well, at a very high level, what we've put together over the years, we've put thousands of hours of research into the training and constantly updating. At a high level, what our training offers, it offers an understanding not just to the senior C-suite of an organization, but to the body of an organization. It offers background on what ESG is, because to many people, they're just hearing these first three, these letters for the first time, these three letters. Now, we're offering background on what it is, why it's so important critically to all of the stakeholders that are involved. And the last part of it, which is the most critical part, is how can I as an individual contribute to our ESG journey, our ESG policies, and our ESG ratings.
Okay. Bob or Dr. Hugh, any additions to that?
Yeah, I would say, just based on my 40-year experience in the energy industry, I've lived through, I hate to admit, maybe 5 cycles, price cycles now. And every time, in the past 4 cycles, when the price of oil, became good and oil became profitable, there was a passing interest, I would say, in ESG. And then when the price went down, so did the interest. But our opinion is this time around, ESG is here to stay, regardless of the price of oil. It's investment community, stakeholder community, the follow-on younger generations all place a great value on social responsibility. So we firmly believe that it's not going to go away, and companies need to deal with it and be proactive. Not a saying that has come up in a number of conversations with our clients is, you control the message, or the message will control you.
That's very wise words, yes.
And I can cite several major oil companies who are on the wrong side of that statement. Oh. Like, you may have seen watched the courtroom against Shell in terms of not moving fast enough on their ESG strategy. And then my alma mater, ExxonMobil, just had a shareholder revolt, and which was very unusual. And so activist shareholders who have a strong interest in ESG rallied some other large institutional investors, and were able to place 3 friendly board members on the ExxonMobil board. And that's certainly going to have a impact on the direction of their strategy. And occurred, to be honest, because if you look at ExxonMobil's stance on ESG and climate change up until now, it's been not very supportive, if you will.
Okay. Dr. Hugh, would you like to add anything in?
Yeah, I would just like to add, Bob hit the nail on the head. ESG is here to stay, and there's still a lot of work to be done for people to fully comprehend the scale and scope of what that means, and then pushing that understanding down through the organization so that everyone understands why this is so important to the long-term sustainability of the organization. So I'll hand it back there. I don't want to take too much time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. And I guess with all the bigger oil and gas companies, getting more involved, that would be a good example, I guess, to set, and it will be more of a roadmap for the rest of the companies to follow suit.
Yeah, exactly. Virtually every mid-size and large integrated oil and gas company has set a stake in the ground to have a zero carbon business by 2030, 2040, 2050. And particularly the large integrateds are devoting several billions of dollars each year as part of their strategy. Money that would have otherwise gone into developing additional hydrocarbons. And so they're setting at a very high level a strong, aggressive, integrated strategy that smaller companies can emulate, maybe partially, but they're good flag, or what the right word is, they're good leaders. Their policies and their strategies are something to look at and to learn from.
Great. So our followers on the ESG Oil and Gas Industry Group specifically would be interested in training for their own industry. But could you elaborate on who you deliver this ESG training to and what industries you're focusing on?
Well, once again, thanks for that question, Andel. It's the industries we're focusing on today. We are preparing to deliver ESG training for the airline industry. We're currently delivering ESG training for the energy industry and not just oil and gas. So today we have ESG training arranged through different industry associations. We're working currently in the United States with the Energy Workforce and Technology Council out of Houston. And we have participants in our ESG training. Actually, I think we're close to over 50 people in that training. The first round that they offered, which is outstanding. It's one of the most successful programs that the Energy Council in Houston has offered. Participants range from, they have members from different client companies, they have member companies, I should say, from across the United States into Europe and overseas into the Middle East. We're delivering as well up in the what's called the Bakken region of the United States, which is up in Bismarck, South Dakota, et cetera. But the North Dakota Petroleum Council is the other organization we're delivering through there. And if we zip back over to the western part of the United States, upper Northwest Texas, up in the Permian, out of Midland, Odessa, we're delivering ESG. Bob and I just came back from Midland from last week. We were delivering our ESG training for the Petroleum Professional Development Center out of Midland College. And of course, in Canada, I can't forget about us Canadians up north of the border here, where we're just finishing next Tuesday on the 22nd of June, the final session for our ESG training for the Petroleum Services Association of Canada. So there's a lot of acronyms in there, but it's something where, again, the interest is growing, and we're being asked to come back and deliver training, not just for the associations, but for private companies who want to get the engagement of more individuals within their group involved in the topic. Anything to add to that, Bob?
No, I think the first wave of interest, as Pat described, Andel, is really what is ESG? And the energy industry knows E quite well, because that's always been a part of our business, is paying attention to how we treat the environment, water, air, land, etc. But S is less known. Social interaction, community support, and then governance has always been well understood at the board level, but governance is now changing such that boards who have chief risk or chief safety officers are now having ESG added to their portfolio. Yes. So the first wave has been help us understand what this is. And then as we finish the training that Pat talked about, we're now being asked by specific companies to come in and say, okay, help us define in detail what an operational strategy is for ESG.
And I believe it would be quite valuable to have the relevant associations on board to help deliver your training. Have you formed any specific strategic partnerships with industry associations?
Yeah, the industry associations that I just mentioned, there's the Energy Workforce and Technology Council. We formed a partnership with, we're actually under our 7th year of not just leadership training, executive training, but they've added both ESG, and the second topic they've added is inclusion and diversity, which is a component of the capital S of ESG. So, and again, the second most popular program for them, but combined between ESG and the IND, the Inclusion and Diversity Program for the Energy Council, we have over 100 people. Like, again, it's their most popular, 2 most popular programs. Other partnerships currently include, again, North Dakota Petroleum Council, the Petroleum Professional Development Center out of Midland, and up in Canada with the Petroleum Services Association of Canada. So each one of those industry associations on energy, we have participants coming through the training. And again, not just oil and gas, we have power transmission, we're looking at power generation, power utility companies, as well on the electricity side, of course, because of the focus on not just coal burning to create electricity, it's natural gas burning to create electricity now.
Okay.
And as part of those associations, and they are all working with their constituency to form or create a voice of that association to stakeholders on their approach and their strategy around ESG. So I know that each of the associations Pat talked about are beginning to put more structure. They all, I think, have lobbyists who are working on the industry's behalf, certainly in the U.S. and in Washington.
Okay. I know most people will be wondering how long they will have to be out of the office for this type of training, or currently maybe not out of the office, maybe just doing a Zoom meeting. Could you elaborate a bit on the length of the training and whether it's a once-off event or if participants will need a refresher course every now and then?
No, that's a good question as well, because the way we've structured the course is if a private company or if a company individually brings us in to do the training, we give them options. We can deliver it as 2 straight days, which quite frankly is always the optimal learning environment when you can immerse yourself in and just block the phones off and stay focused for a couple of good days. And plus, usually what we find is on the in-between day of a 2-day session, you get a little bit of that social time where you can really come together and have conversations about the topic and really make it not just it's almost an edutaining environment, not just educational, but slightly entertaining. So with some organizations during this whole period during the pandemic, we've separated for some of the other associations our 2-day training into 4 half-days so that we don't have our backsides welded into a chair all day, if you know what I mean. And so, it's interesting. It depends on the environment that different groups want. And we're in discussion with some individual companies who are hoping to do it 1 day here, 1 day there, so it's an assortment, but really the training itself should be 3 days long, to be straight. There's so much content to cover off. And as we put together our content, we're constantly refining with the help of the committees and the groups within the industry associations we're working with, because of the constantly changing environment of ESG. But to really have individuals, consciously aware of the how, not just the what and the why, but of the how they can actually contribute. We have a series of exercises we take different participants in the training through so that they are equipped to do a 180 and help others within their organization understand and know not just what it is, why it's so important, but how they can contribute as well. So it's a pay it forward scheme in terms of training so that we can actually have others equipped to take this message forward.
So you're quite flexible in, just helping the company to fit in with whatever they require.
Absolutely. And specific areas of focus too. That carbon capture is a big thing for the energy industry. Now, the capital S, if you look at some of the measurement agencies that are out there, such as SASB, the new IIRC combination of SASB and GRI included in their CDP, et cetera. But when you're looking at the measurement areas of energy, SASB is only measuring 8 specific materiality items right now, and we're encouraging people to go beyond that and become world-class in their ESG reporting by including items both on the S and the G at a higher level and in a more rounded scope. And the aptitude and the interest in doing that is actually wide and deep, and it's very impressive to see that. Anything to add to that, Hugh?
No, I think the key point there is that I think you have said often, you can't manage what you don't measure. And as the ESG becomes more and more sophisticated and more regulations get applied, it's important that organizations not only understand why they need to do something. It's not a cost issue in many ways. In fact, in all ways, it's a sustainability issue. If your company is going to continue to thrive, it has got to have an ESG strategy in place. And when you give people the training, they start understanding, where does this fit into my overall business model? And I think that's the first step of understanding why it's important, and then working with them to help them implement a strategy has been a secondary component of what we do. So I think that's something where I think we can provide a lot of value just through the deep knowledge we have in ESG, and helping them, as Bob said, to integrate that into their overall long-term business strategy. That's my perspective. But Bob, would you like to say anything?
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head as well, Hugh. You know, when students come into our training, we give them a little pre-work. In fact, we're just doing that for the second set of students for the Midland College. And you come in with an understanding of or a written statement of your company's strategy. And then if you can find it, most companies now have a complimentary statement of their ESG strategy on their company website. So we ask students to come in with both, and then our approach is to link corporate strategy to the implications of ESG, and then define what does that mean. Not only it's already defined at the executive level, but how do you translate that down to the worker, you know, in the field or in the store, and what are the implications for them?
And that's quite important. I mean, I think up for a while back, it was more the C-suite level, you know, just board level, and not the whole company wasn't really involved. But that is becoming abundantly clear that everybody in the company needs to be involved and know what the bigger vision is. So I think you guys definitely help with that. Like you said, with the 180 degree, if they can go into their own company after the ESG training and be able to assist other people, that is really where I think that's a great benefit to have in the training. With ESG being quite a complex topic to understand and to implement, do you offer one-on-one support after the training to assist participants with specific questions that they might have about their firm's own ESG efforts?
And we most definitely do. And actually with the Energy Council, Energy Workforce and Technology Council, their program, we've built in one-on-one support by way of coaching, specific one-on-one coaching for the participants of that program. Hugh, Bob, myself, and the rest of our partnership through the Envision team. And we're spending time outside of the training just to ensure that we're helping cater the unique and authentic needs of each leader and organization to ensure that they've got the tools to move forward. And, just on that, Bob's talking about ESG strategy, which is critically important to every organization. The interesting part on strategy, Andel, is that in most organizations, and this is a statistic that has been researched and found, is that strategy in most organizations is only clear, understood, and effective 2.5 layers down, including the C-suite. Layers of leadership down into any, and you look at multiple organizations, large multinationals can have as many as 11 layers of leadership. And if your strategy is only clear, understood, and effective 2.5 layers down, you're in for it. And there's an opportunity within the bulk of that organization to engage, align, and create efficiencies that can be unheard of. Anything to add to that, Bob?
Yeah, and typically in any organization of size, it turns out that the middle managers are I'll use a geologic term, the impermeable layer. So strategy comes down and bounces off middle management. Good ideas come up from the field and they bounce off middle management. So a big part of our work is to break through that barrier to make sure strategy ripples all the way down, and then good ideas and clarity go back up. It's ExxonMobil, we used a phrase called a clear line of sight. And so that's what we try to establish, especially from the individual worker and small team level. So, which we've feels important. And one last comment is Pat cited a while back, a Harvard Business School study concluded that firms who have this clear line of sight generally outperform their peers by an average of 5% total shareholder return year on year. So it's definitely significant.
Yes. Great. Dr. Hugh, would you like to add anything on?
Yeah, I was just smiling to myself. I like Bob's comment about an impermeable layer. And the challenge is, regardless of the business you're in, if that strategy, the overall strategic direction of the company, is not well understood down through the organization, it just causes confusion, distrust across the organization, and a lot of wasted effort as people start doing things that are in opposition to each other as opposed to being totally aligned. With ESG being referentially a new area of focus by organizations, and because it's changing so quickly, it's going to take a lot of focus, not only in terms of understanding what ESG is really about, but in making sure that it is understood through the organization. That will be a major advantage. If the companies can get that organized, it will make a big difference to how they perform, as Bob has just said. I think it's going to be critical for organizations not only to pass through that impermeable barrier, but to get everyone aligned that ESG is a fundamental requirement of organizations going forward.
Definitely, can't agree more. And since I started this ESG journey specific to the oil and gas industry, I've been chasing down a rather elusive answer, which I hope you can answer for me today. Does your training connect specific activities to each category of the 3 ESG pillars, being environmental, social, and corporate governance, that allows them to improve that specific category?
Well, you know, Bob, if I can jump on that and then I'll hand it over to you. It's interesting because really there's 5 categories, within ESG. If you look at the SASB, I believe they call them dimensions, but the 5 dimensions of SASB. So what we touch on is each one of them. There's governance and business ethics. There's climate change and energy. There's environment. Third, number 4 is really safety, health, and security. You look at what happened to Colonial on the security side in the southern United States with that hack taking down their pipeline system. And the final, number 5, but not of less significance, is social. And I know that SASB, they categorize their dimensions as leadership and governance, and same thing modeled there: business model and innovation, environment, human capital. Number 4 is, and number 5 is social capital. So when we actually look at each one of the items of materiality, we're constantly researching the most popular, and not the standard and the norm in terms of materiality. We're starting to really research leading edge items of materiality that companies are being recognized and applauded for. And currently we've got 42 different topics under those 5 categories. And the one that's loaded up the most is social, and that's the one that's not being measured by SASB today. And Bob, anything to add to that?
Yeah, and if I add maybe some, I think you were asking for some maybe specific examples of where an ESG strategy has impact or value generation. So social, in the energy industry, a big part of social is how do you interface with the local community, where you're doing business, where you're drilling wells, where you're building pipelines. And in our industry, we call it the right to operate. And I think the best example of, it's all public domain, so I don't mind chatting about this, is you may be familiar with the long history of the Keystone Pipeline, which is a large pipeline to carry Canadian heavy oil down to the U.S. refineries in the Gulf Coast. And as you may have noted, last week, TransCanada Pipeline canceled that project, and largely because of, in my opinion, not having a very coherent, effective, forward-leaning strategy to bring the stakeholders into the approval process and gain their consent. So it's really important on the social side. And On the positive side, if you're in the Permian, there's a group of, I think about 20 producers who have come together, established a $100, $200 million fund to help the local communities build out infrastructure, schools, fire stations, emergency response. And by doing so, you know, they're gaining consent and support of the local community. So that's very important. Again, we call it the right or the license to operate, and that's the you know, the consent of the communities that we impact. Very important.
Well, and Bob, to add to that, it's interesting because when we were in the Petroleum Professional Development Center at Midland College last week, one of the items of conversation during our training made by one of the members of our program, the participants, is that the energy industry largely, you know, I think the volume of investment that comes from the oil and gas industry into sustainability and technology to improve the environment is really not touted and talked about enough. And it's interesting because the oil and gas industry, you know, on the energy side, has largely been an industry and a sector that just hasn't really touted what it is that they're doing well enough. And I think if the world truly knew what was happening in terms of technology, investment, and innovation coming out of that industry, I think the world would be surprised at what's happening to have responsible development and responsible industry.
Yeah. And so we talked about what I call the right to operate, by having good relationships with and buy-in from the local communities whom we operate with. And, you know, a bad example is what happened to the Keystone Pipeline. A good example is we, Envision, have a client in Canada who is a large Indigenous construction company, and we're working with them on strategy and funding for them to help improve through their business the daily lives of a large population of First Nations in Canada. So that's another example of positive impact.
I received quite a few opposing answers to my next question. And I think, yeah, Bob, you did mention earlier that it is quite difficult for a company to achieve this. Is it even possible for an oil and gas company to achieve a good ESG rating?
Well, why don't you go ahead with Bob with that, Bob, and I'll follow you up.
Yeah. Well, yeah, absolutely. You know, it's about, as Pat or Hugh said, first of all, you have to have measurement systems in place. And so on the E side, it's very easy to put in place a plan and measurement and reporting such that air emissions, carbon emissions, water spillage, water usage, what else? Land impact. You can all put very specific goals in place and demonstrate progress, which the energy industry has been pretty good at because that's always been core to our business. On the social side, similarly, some energy companies are very, very good with community involvement and impact. But again, you can put performance measurements in place, dollars spent, schools built, roads repaired, and measure and demonstrate progress. And then at the governance side, a little squishier, but changing the governance model at the board level, where you actually designate someone, a chief ESG and safety and environmental officer, which firms are beginning to do. And so that then puts a high-level governance over everything, coordinates reporting, and then, you know, holds executives and down to individuals accountable for performance. There are a number of energy firms, I don't have their names in my head, who have now made part of ESG performance a measured element in bonus programs.
Yes, I saw that, yes. That should be quite a great addition. It's going to push
Yes,
them to adapt very quickly. Thanks, Pat. I believe you wanted to also add on to that.
See, again, you've got the top level executives in most companies, and when it comes to execution and really winding the concept of ESG into the culture and the fabric of an organization is an interesting concept. And what's interesting is, as you look at organizations, again, we'd mentioned that 2.5 layers of strategy effectiveness for most organizations. It's interesting because looking at anything below, you've got the C-suite of most organizations, you've got SVP or AVP, then VP. What's interesting is when you have an approach in place within an organization to have that bottom-up engagement and feedback and input on some of the objectives for an organization, whether it's ESG strategy or anything else. Bob's talking about the multiplier effect that can really be created when you have that bottom-up engagement of ESG input and actions and behaviors come from that, from some of the people that might even be boots on the ground right up to the C-suite. Bob, anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think if you have an awareness at the operational level, then it changes how people act. I use another negative example, Endil, is in the Bakken, which is one of the big U.S. shale plays. There's a story about a field hand who had a tanker load of salt water because the wells there produce a lot of salt. Now, you should take that, if you're following process, you take that tanker of salt water to a disposal well and you inject it deep into the earth. Well, it was late in the day. This individual was in a hurry to get home. He just pulled over to the side of the road and dumped it in a ditch. And of course, guess what? The salt water just spread out into a farmer's field, destroyed a large number of acres. It cost the operator several $100,000 to remediate. So that's the kind of stuff that can be avoided by just a clear understanding of each individual, each worker's responsibility for a firm's ESG strategy.
Well, and it's sorry to jump in on this, but I'm just passionate about this as well as the sense. Bob, we heard this term come out in multiple training sessions for ESG, but if you don't cascade strategy beyond that 2.5 layers, I think the term is called greenwashing, isn't it, Bob?
Yes.
Yeah, I'm sure you've heard that, and where you make unsubstantiated claims about your ESG strategy, but they're just unsubstantiated claims, right?
Just for the brand image.
Exactly.
Absolutely. And then you look over in the airline industry, to bring Dr. Hugh back into the conversation. One of the other items of jest that was put out there recently within some of the sessions we've been running. I don't think too many of us that are flying and hopping back on aircraft are going to be comfortable jumping on a solar powered jet through any of the major providers. So, it's interesting because every flight that happens, Hugh, has a carbon footprint each time an aircraft takes off. And it's interesting because that carbon footprint does need to be offset and technology in place to begin measuring so that we can manage that more effectively. Anything to add to that?
No, you're correct, Bob. I mean, the airlines are working hard to have technology offsets, and you see continuous work by both aircraft manufacturers and engine manufacturers to drive improvements in efficiency. The challenge for the engine manufacturers, of course, which are generating the emission gases, is that the only way to make these engines even more efficient than they are today is to make them bigger, so they get more flow of air that don't actually go through the burn chamber. However, that has physical implications for the design of the aircraft and how high they are, how tall the undercarriage is, etc. But what we are seeing is that those tend to be longer term issues about next generation aircraft, etc. But what you're seeing now is airlines currently typically using voluntary mechanisms, so that when you're making your booking for an airline, it will come up on the more advanced airlines. Would you like to make a contribution to offset your carbon footprint? There'll be calculators on the system to determine just how much greenhouse gases you're emitting, and then what a typical offset might be. and then they're making it voluntary for the consumer to purchase that offset, again, as part of their social responsibility. I see that as a great first step, but it's only the first step. Eventually, as governing authorities and national governments start putting into place stricter and stricter rules, those carbon offsets will become mandatory, and the airlines will be forced to put in processes which will ensure that everyone is offsetting their share of the carbon footprint. And of course, that's one of the challenges that we face in all industries is as we go down the supply chain from the, let's say, the generator of the oil to the actual consumer of that energy source. How do we make sure that everyone contributes their fair share along the entire supply chain? So airlines will be looking at that in terms of the actual final usage of the fuel, but I think you're going to see that have to be implemented at all stages down the supply chain. That is a very complex challenge, and Bob, you probably have more insights on that from the energy side, but I'll pass it back to you. Everyone is going to have to take their fair share of offsetting their carbon footprint.
Yeah, that is a very complex issue. You know, who owns the carbon, who's accountable for the carbon, and I know we're watching with the new U.S. government maybe having warmer relationships with the rest of the world. I know a topic of discussion, Andel, is what about border carbon tax, right? So, and that don't know how that's going to progress yet, but if it does, you know, that's going to be, as Hugh said, an enormous element of complexity that gets added to the supply chain and the carbon emissions considerations associated with the supply chain.